Thank you so much, Nick. I'm delighted to be here and thank you so much for the opportunity. And I'm going to give a little bit of context about the Smith family and about some of the work that we do. And then I'm going to pass to my terrific colleague, Kirsten Hancock, to walk people through the data. So as Nick just said, this is the long topic that we're going to be talking about, but then Kirsten, we might just move to the next slide. So the context of the Smith family, we're a not-for-profit national organisation, a charity in Australia, and our focus is on supporting disadvantaged children to achieve educationally over the long term. We support at scale 220,000 children, young people a year, and the largest program we have, and for which we're going to be talking with you about some of the data, is our long-term educational scholarship program called Learning for Life. These are all financially disadvantaged children who can be in either primary school, secondary school or tertiary, and there are 58,000 children on that program now. And so we are longitudinally tracking their attendance, their achievement, their Year 12 completion, their post-school engagement in employment, education and training, and we also have an array of demographic and admin data. So a very large longitudinal data set, which is unique in Australia. In terms of where these young people are located, we just had Wojtek talking to us about remote. All of our students are in either outer metropolitan areas or in regional areas, so not in remote. 1 in 5 of them are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background young people, and significant proportions of them have health and disability challenges. So a very rich array of young people who participate on our program over the long term. And we'll be sharing with you some of the data that we have of a particular cohort of Learning for Life students. Aside with this, complementing this work is a new initiative funded by the Australian government called Growing Careers, which is a pilot initiative aiming to support, we hope, a more integrated and sequenced approach to career support, very much drawing, Anthony, on a range of the work that you have done over time, trying to provide to young people as they move through high school, so financially disadvantaged low SES children, a much more integrated, sequenced approach to career support, wrapping around an evaluation, so around 76,000 instances of support over 4 years. Thanks, Kirsten. But the particular project which is aligned to the Learning for Life initiative that we'd like to share with you tonight is the Pathways Education and Transition Study, the PET study, and it's interested in what are the post-school pathways taken by young people experiencing disadvantage, what's influencing those factors, and really importantly, what might be done to improve the post-school engagement of young people. Our methodology, it's a longitudinal one. We're focusing in particular on Year 10, so that's the third last year of school, so young people around 15 or 16 years who were in Year 10 in 2020 on Learning for Life, and young people who were in Year 12, the final year of school, in 2020. We are surveying them in 2021, 22 and 23. And we're also doing a longitudinal qualitative interview with a subset of those young people. So 60 of those young people across a mix of characteristics, again in 2021, 22 and 23. And we'd like to share with you a little bit of the Wave 1 data, both quantitatively and qualitatively, that's focusing in particular on career support. The benefit of that long-term engagement of students on the program means that we'll be able to combine all of this new data with the achievement data, the demographic data that we have on them as they've moved through school. And so, thanks, Kirsten. Just to give you a little bit of a flavour of Wave 1, how large a sample it is, it's around 4,600 young people, all of them low SES, all of them are involved in the Learning for Life program, and a fantastic response rate. We were absolutely delighted with that. And as you can see, we've got a good weighting, both of metro and non-metro. There's not much of a bias there in terms of our sample size, and the qualitative component there, 60 interviews. All of this data has been done, and we're in the process of analysing the wads of data, and we'd like to share with you some of that today. And I'll now pass to Kirsten.
Thanks, Anne. So the focus of what we wanted to do was to align with the conference and use the data that we had where we could. And we're tying this into the research that we've seen, and some of the earlier talks today are going to be very valuable for fleshing out some of this context. But looking at the research where we can see that disadvantaged students in Australia tend to receive fewer career advice opportunities than other students, and they have lower rates of post-school engagement in employment, education or training. And often there are discussions about how these two things are linked, and this is part of the Growing Careers project in terms of improving those supports so that those long-term outcomes can also be improved. So it's in this context that our research questions are looking at who gets career support in our sample of young disadvantaged students, and there's not a lot of research that dives into these experiences specifically. So we're asking what characteristics are associated with either receiving support or receiving support that young people think is useful, and whether the support they get is linked with higher rates of that post-secondary engagement in work or study. We're also interested if some students appear to benefit more than other students and where those supports appear to be more beneficial. And we draw on the qualitative research to tell us about what young people tell us about their experiences of career support, what works well, what could be done better, and what is it that they find is really helpful. So for this particular analysis, we draw on two main questions from the survey. We had two cohorts of students. We have a year 10 cohort and a year 12 cohort. So year 12 is the final year of school. So in 2021, we've got year 11s and then young people in the first year after school. So they were asked if their school has or did provide them with support, advice or information about possible careers or post-school options. This was a yes/no question. And then if they said yes, how useful was it in helping you decide on your post-school options? And they could rate this from 1 to 5. For the analysis today, we've combined those options into a 4-level variable, as you'll see shortly, that highlights whether they got any advice and how useful it was. So in the survey, we also collect other contextual information. The focus of the study is what they're doing now. So there's plenty of questions that relate to their study, employment and training activities. And this is one of the outcomes we're most interested in. We've also got a few questions in there concerning health and well-being and questions like life satisfaction, because we know that these are factors that are very salient to the young students on our Learning for Life scholarship. We have some prior information about their English and maths achievement that's been collected from their school reports along the way, and part of that longitudinal data set that Anne had mentioned, along with other data that's collected in previous years in relation to family structure and some information about their primary carer and their education and employment level, and a little bit that's been linked in about some of their school characteristics, like the level of school advantage, because a lot of our young people are dispersed across lots of different types of schools. So for the first key question, the analytic approach, asking about which students are more likely to report receiving support or finding it useful. We've just identified a set of candidate variables and tested if they're linked to that career support or not. And that list has been drawn from what we would expect to see given previous research. And then if they sort of make that first cut of being linked with career support, then we put them into a regression model to see what happens when they're sort of combined at the same time. For the second question about how career support is linked to post-secondary engagement outcomes, we take a similar approach of looking at what's linked with those outcomes and adjust for the variables that we find are important from this first stage of the analysis. This didn't work as well as we expected, sort of highlighting something fell over along the way, but I'll talk about that shortly. So getting into the results, so for both cohorts, the year 10 and the year 12 cohort, we find that the vast majority of students report receiving career support. So only 14 and 15% said they didn't get anything at school, meaning that 85, 86% did. And of those who did receive support, the most common response was they found it useful, which is good. Not many were saying that they didn't find it useful. There is quite a large section in the middle that are a bit ambivalent about that support they received, and they're not quite sure whether it's useful or not. This could be there's not been enough time to figure out if it's useful, if they're not quite down a long way on that pathway yet. So this table provides just the bivariate unadjusted associations with some of the key variables that we looked at. And I've only included the ones that are linked with receiving useful career support. These are just standard chi-square tests. So for both cohorts, if they've for the year 10 cohort, if you're still at school, and if you're in the year 12 cohort, if you completed school, both of these are associated with receiving useful career support. And this makes sense because if you're at school, you've got more chance to receive those opportunities. In our sample, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people found their support more useful than non-Indigenous students within this context of disadvantaged young people. Students who get suspended are less likely to report getting any career support. Again, that might be an opportunity factor. But beyond those things, most of the key associates with getting support or finding it useful related to these wellbeing items like life satisfaction, if they have a self-reported mental health condition, if they've got lower self-rated physical health, and so on. Year 9 English achievement, again, those with higher achievement more likely to say they've been getting useful career support. And for our year 12 cohort specifically, our disadvantaged students in more advantaged schools were less likely to say that they found the support useful, and I'll talk about that finding in a little more detail. So the regression models, these are multinomial logistic regression models, which provide the relative likelihood of a young person finding the support being not useful as opposed to useful in the first column, not useful, sorry, not getting support is the first column, not useful is the second column, and that ambivalent category of neither in the third column. So this is for the year 10, and these are all adjusted analyses. And again, we find that the mental health, the general health, the life satisfaction, even in the same model, were all linked with reports of either getting the report, getting career support or finding it useful, not useful as opposed to useful. And for the year 10 students only, if they report their main income as coming from Centrelink, they're less likely to find the support as being not useful, which we're not quite sure about that finding at this stage. For the year 12 cohort, again, those findings are very similar, so I'm not going to dwell on them in too much detail, except to point to the bottom two, which relate to the school advantage findings I mentioned before. So the measure that we use here is called ICSIA. The Australians will understand what that is. It's a variable where the average school is 1,000. So if you're less than 1,000, you're in a less advantaged school, and above 1,000, it's a more advantaged school. The majority of our students are in less advantaged schools because of the population that we're talking about. But in this case, if they were in just slightly less than average or above average advantaged schools, they were more likely to say that the support they received was not useful than useful compared to students in the much more disadvantaged schools. And we're looking at this as a potential indicator of the different types of advice that are likely to be provided in advantaged and disadvantaged schools, and how well that relates to the disadvantaged students in those schools. Just to pick out some of those findings to sort of elaborate what this looked like in more detail. So for the early school leavers, for example, the year 10 cohort graph is on the left, and just looking at those bottom percentages of who gets support. So if they're not at school anymore, for the year 10 cohort, 42% said they didn't get support compared to 13% who are still at school, which is quite a large difference. And for the year 12 cohort, that gap there is 26% compared to 12. And for the mental health measure that I've mentioned, this is for the year 12 cohort, but it looked very similar for the year 10s. So for self-rated mental health, if that was poor, only 25% of young people are saying that they've received useful career support while at school, compared to 65% who are rating their mental health as excellent. So we're cautious about interpreting this in any causal sort of way, but this is a clear indicator that young people with mental health concerns don't perceive that they're getting very useful support at school. And so this, I think, is worthy of further investigation of what would be useful for these young people. So when we look at the second part of the question, which was, possibly the one that we were very interested in about is career support linked with post-school engagement outcomes. For our general reporting, we combine all of the different types of engagement into a single variable, and we look at this as not engaged in education, work or training at least part-time, partially engaged as if they're in either work or study part-time, and fully engaged is engaged full-time. That's what these measures reflect. So the first graph on the left is just whether or not the young person receives support, and this is not a statistically significant difference. Very slightly higher proportion of young people are fully engaged if they receive support at school than not receiving support. And if we look at the combined variable where we've got the 4 levels of whether that support was useful, what we find is that the profile of engagement looks very similar for young people who said they got no support, and if they were ambivalent about that support and not clear. And we've also got very similar profiles, different to the other groups, but similar to each other, if they received not useful support and if they received useful support. So this is sort of flummoxing us a little bit, and it's difficult to unpack that much further when we're not really quite sure what these differences mean. So that will be the focus of some future work. One thing we did want to look at with this though, there was a question that came to us about the early school leavers, and if they're not at school because they received useful advice that led them onto the pathway that they were interested in. And these are very low numbers, but we did find some evidence here looking at the year 12 cohort, for example, on the right. If they left school early but received useful advice, 71% of those young people are fully engaged, compared to if they left school early and didn't get any advice or unuseful advice was 39%. So there is some evidence there to suggest that young people do get some advice that might lead them to leave school early, but it's putting them on a pathway that's more relevant for their circumstances and getting into what they want to do a bit earlier. Onto the qualitative study results, and just in the interest of time, I won't read out the quotes, but just focus on the general messages that came out from the interviews with the young people. And across the board, as reflected in the earlier presentations, the young people in this study relied on a mix of supports when making decisions about their pathways. This included significant adults in their lives, particularly teachers, and guidance counsellors, but also family, parents, colleagues, or just other relatives that they trust. A lot of the early school leavers who were interviewed for the qualitative study did express that they needed more support while they were at school. So this is obviously an area for further work here, and particularly in relation to picking the right subjects for what they wanted to do. And a really strong message that came out from the qualitative study was that the support that young people want and the support that they value is in the form of a two-way conversation with someone who knows them and what they want to do and has the time to explore what they want to do in life and understands the options for them so that they can achieve their goals. I don't think that's surprising, but it was a very strong message. So we focused on two sources of that school support, which were teachers and career counsellors. Teachers, I think, were roundly noted by young people as being really instrumental for young people and being that person who can really help them understand what they want to do. And this is because teachers know them and they know what their strengths are and can generate ideas for that young person and help them identify different pathways forward. Not always, though. So some young people did report that teachers sometimes had ideas about success that didn't match what the young person wanted to do. And this really was about young people might have a different idea about a pathway they want to follow, but their teachers are, you will try university and you need year 11 and year 12 and these are the subjects you need to do for that. And part of that they thought was about the school's reporting obligations and how nice it looks when they have lots of year 12 completers and young people going on to university. With the career counsellors, young people said very similar things. So where they did utilise those sort of services that were in the school, they generally found them helpful in thinking about different possibilities. And just having that chat with someone was quite valuable. But again, even the career counsellors in the schools could sometimes be a bit myopic about the valuable pathways for those young people. So to summarise the findings here, there's plenty in this survey we could have talked about, but what we find is that the vast majority of disadvantaged young people in the study report receiving some kind of career support at school. Unfortunately, we couldn't dive into the different types. We didn't have space in the survey to do that. And more students said that the advice they received was useful than not useful, which was a positive finding. Those who are more likely to rate the support as useful included those who are still at school or who had completed school, Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander young people, and those with higher self-rated levels of life satisfaction, health and mental health. We did find the interesting finding about those in less advantaged schools.
This is both orally and written exam that people don't know that it's not a professional. Good point.
Yes, we were still, I have to apologize for that. And I don't know whether it is my end or the other end. I really don't know.
So, sorry. Those in the less advantaged schools, so disadvantaged students in more advantaged schools is not finding that advice as being very useful for them, and that could be linked to the that view about what pathways students in those schools should be taking. So despite the value and the usefulness of the support that young people were reporting, the relationship between their post-secondary outcomes was not clear. And I think there's a few reasons for this, and that is that the outcome is just too soon when we're talking only the early parts of this year when young people have finished school last year. And another is that we know young people are getting advice from all sorts of sources and avenues, and if they're not getting the right support at school, they can go to other places for that information, and that's going to make it hard to link these pathways. The qualitative interviews, however, did give us very clear examples of how the support they get at school and from specific people has led to better post-secondary outcomes for those who weren't quite sure what they wanted to do, and then that helped really put them on the right pathway. The next steps for us, we have more data to link in terms of the school-based programs that the Smith family and the Learning for Life delivers for young people. And in wave 2, we're looking at collecting more detailed information about the types of support that young people were getting in school, but also outside of school. And then gaining some further insights on why some young people more and not finding this support delivered as being useful. So like those in advantaged schools and those who are having mental health difficulties or other troubles with life, and what sort of supports might be more useful for them.